Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning. You go to fill up your car, and gas is $6 a gallon. You open your grocery app. Prices are up 22%. You scroll through your phone, and the headline reads, IMF warns the world economy is heading toward recession. Your first thought? Some war is happening somewhere far away. Doesn't affect me. But here's the thing. You're dead wrong. Because 7,000 miles away, in a narrow strip of ocean, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, one country closed a door. And that one door, it controls 20% of all the world's oil. Every barrel that powers your truck, your factory, your flight, your plastic water bottle, the fertilizer that grows your food, it comes through that door. That door is the Strait of Hormuz. And on February 28, 2026, it slammed shut. Here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't just a Middle East story. This is your story. It's showing up in your gas bill, your grocery receipt, and your 401k. The question is, how did we get here? Who wins? Who loses? And can the global economy survive without that door reopening? Let's break it down.
To understand the disaster, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. Picture a bottleneck, a narrow sea passage between Iran on the north and Oman on the south, at its narrowest 21 miles across. Through this tiny corridor flows roughly 11 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That's about 20% of global oil trade. Add liquefied natural gas, fertilizers, petrochemicals, aluminum, and you're looking at the single most important commercial waterway on Earth. The key players you need to know: Iran, the country controlling the northern coast of the strait, holding it essentially hostage. The United States and Israel, who on February 28, 2026, launched a coordinated military operation called Operation Epic Fury, targeting Iranian nuclear sites and military infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Gulf oil giants whose entire export economy depends on safe passage through this strait. China, India, Japan, South Korea, Europe. The massive energy importers on the other end who collectively receive most of that oil. Until February 28th, the world economy was actually doing surprisingly well. Despite Trump's tariffs, despite the Ukraine war dragging on, global growth was tracking at 3.3% in 2026. The IMF was relatively optimistic. Oil was sitting under $80 a barrel. Maersk ships were moving through the strait without incident. Insurance premiums for oil tankers were a routine 0.125% of ship value per transit. But there were warning signs nobody wanted to see. Failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva, a prior 12-day air conflict between Israel and Iran in 2025, ship insurance premiums quietly doubling in the weeks before the strikes, Iran almost strategically flooding the market with extra oil exports in mid-February, as if it knew exactly what was coming. Nobody connected the dots. But here's where it gets interesting. February 28, 2026. The US and Israel launched strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury. Targets: nuclear facilities, military command centers, senior leadership. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei is dead. But Iran had a plan B ready. Within 24 hours, Iranian forces begin targeting oil tankers near the strait. 3 tankers are struck. One is set on fire off the coast of Oman. Major shipping companies, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, immediately suspend all transits through the strait and the related Red Sea routes. Tanker traffic drops 70% almost overnight, then to near zero. At the same time, Houthi-controlled Yemen announces the resumption of attacks on ships in the Red Sea, forcing even Suez Canal traffic to reroute all the way around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. That detour adds 2 to 3 weeks to shipping times. Costs explode. Let's do the math. A typical oil tanker transit through Hormuz takes hours. The alternative, going around Africa, adds 15 to 20 days to every trip. Insurance premiums for tankers that do attempt the strait jump from 0.125% to 0.4% of ship value. For a very large crude carrier, that's $250,000 per trip, just in extra insurance. Multiply that across the global tanker fleet, and you start to see the scale. The door wasn't just closed, it was booby-trapped.
Here's a number: $126. That's the price Brent crude hit in March 2026, up from roughly $80 before the war, a surge of nearly 60% in under 2 weeks. This was the largest monthly increase in oil prices ever recorded in history. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, the most credible energy watchdog on the planet, called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Let that sink in for a second. Bigger than the 1973 Yom Kippur oil embargo. Bigger than the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Bigger than the 1990 Gulf War. The biggest energy shock ever. And here's why the numbers get scary fast. Babak Hafizi, professor of international business at American University, did the math. He said, for every $10 sustained increase in oil per barrel, GDP growth falls by 0.4%. So a $60 increase above the pre-war average, that's negative 2.4% off global GDP by itself, before you factor in shipping delays, supply chain breakdowns, spiking inflation, or tightening interest rates. Quick pause. If you've been wondering why your gas bill, your grocery bill, and your airfare are all up right now, this is exactly why. Hit subscribe if you want to keep understanding the world at this level. And by the way, at the pump, the average price for a gallon of regular gas in America hit $4.11, up from $2.98 on the day the war started. That's a 38% spike in under 2 months, felt by every single American family.
Oil. Everyone's talking about oil. But here's what the mainstream media completely missed. The Strait doesn't just carry crude, it carries the building blocks of modern civilization. Let me run through what's now in short supply across the world. Fertilizer. The Arabian Gulf accounts for at least 20% of all global seaborne fertilizer exports, and 46% of global urea, the world's most widely used nitrogen fertilizer, comes from this region. No fertilizer means lower crop yields. Lower crop yields means food prices spike in 12 to 18 months. This one's a slow burn, but it's coming. Aluminum. UAE aluminum shipments through the Strait have dried up. Aluminum is in your car, your iPhone, your aircraft, your beer can, all of it. Methanol. About a third of global seaborne methanol trade passes through Hormuz. It goes into plastics, paints, synthetic fabrics. China's methanol port inventories are approaching what analysts are calling below warning thresholds. Nearly half of all global seaborne sulfur passes through the Strait. It feeds chemical manufacturing, battery production, and agricultural supply chains. Plastics. Professor Usha Haley, a supply chain expert at Wichita State University, put it bluntly. About 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East move through this route. Shortages will raise the price of packaging, automotive parts, and consumer goods across the board. Jet fuel. Airlines across Asia and parts of Europe are already reporting jet fuel shortages. Italy and Vietnam have both flagged supply crunches. European airports are warning of potential flight cancellations heading into summer. This isn't just an oil crisis. This is a materials crisis, food crisis, a manufacturing crisis, all wearing the same disguise.
Now here's where it gets really wild, so stay with me. Not every country is getting hit the same way. The IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook, literally titled Global Economy in the Shadow of War, is a map of who's bleeding and who's surprisingly not. Hardest hit? Iran. The IMF slashed Iran's 2026 growth forecast by 7.2 percentage points, resulting in a projected contraction of 6.1%. The country that caused the crisis is destroying its own economy in the process. Eurozone, growth cut from 1.4% to 1.1%. Europe imports enormous quantities of natural gas through Hormuz. Germany's industrial sector is facing an energy cost crunch that's threatening manufacturing output. Japan gets roughly 95% of its crude from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar. About 70% of that oil travels through Hormuz. Japan has already asked its refiners to start drawing down emergency stockpiles. The Philippines imports 98% of its oil from the Middle East. On March 24th, President Marcos declared a state of national energy emergency, the first country in the world to do so following this war. Sub-Saharan Africa. The IMF cut its growth outlook from 4.6% to 4.3%. These are countries with limited fiscal space, high debt loads, and zero buffer. No subsidies to offer their citizens. They absorb the full shock. Unexpected winners? Russia, an energy export. Higher oil prices mean higher revenues. The IMF actually upgraded Russia's growth forecast.
A war in the Middle East is perversely helping rescue Russia's economy, the same economy the West tried to cripple with sanctions after Ukraine backing Ukraine. India, facing serious disruption as a huge oil importer, but robust domestic demand and public investment are holding it up. IMF projects 6.5% growth. However, the fertilizer disruption is a slow-moving threat to Indian agriculture that hasn't fully landed yet. China, partially shielded because of its massive investment in renewables and EVs over the past decade. Also, Iran is still allowing Chinese-flagged vessels through the strait. That's what geopolitical hedging looks like in practice.
Here's the kicker. A ceasefire was announced on April 8th. 2 weeks of no military strikes. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Except the strait didn't reopen. Iran has made it clear it wants to institutionalize its control of the Strait of Hormuz after this war ends. They floated the idea of a toll system, charging ships for passage through what is, under international law, a universal transit corridor. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says no single country has the right to close or charge tolls for passage through an international strait. Iran's closure is a direct breach of international maritime law. And then, things got even messier. On April 12th, President Trump announced a U.S. naval blockade of any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. Iran called it a potential ceasefire violation. Now you've got 2 blockades, one from Iran, one from the United States, staring each other down across the narrowest, most important shipping lane on Earth. Iran negotiated its own patchwork of exceptions. Chinese, Russian, Indian, Iraqi, and Pakistani vessels were allowed through. Malaysia and Thailand got access after diplomatic talks. The Philippines got access on April 2nd after formal negotiations. This isn't a strait anymore. It's a geopolitical toll booth where your access depends entirely on whose side your country is on. The Atlantic Council described it perfectly. The collapse of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is 2 problems at once. Problem 1, the immediate supply shock for oil, gas, and a dozen other commodities. Problem 2, even if the strait reopened tomorrow, the logistical damage would persist for months. Rerouted tankers, stranded cargo, backed up supply chains. The damage isn't just at the choke point, it ripples outward for months.
Let's run the final numbers. The IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook. Global growth cut from 3.3% to 3.1%. That's over $300 billion in lost global economic output. Global inflation raised from 3.8% to 4.4%, almost entirely driven by energy costs. U.S. gas prices up from $2.98 per gallon on February 28th to $4.11 today, a 38% spike. U.S. wholesale prices surged 4% in a single month. But here's the scenario that keeps economists up at night. The IMF's worst-case projection. If energy supply disruptions extend into late 2026, inflation expectations come unanchored, and financial markets reprice risk sharply, global growth falls to 2%. Inflation exceeds 6%. 2% global growth. By any historical benchmark, that is the edge of a worldwide recession. The Dallas Fed research ran modeling on Hormuz closure scenarios. They're finding if the strait stays closed for 3 consecutive quarters, global GDP growth falls by 1.3 percentage points. For the US economy alone, that translates to over $1 trillion in lost output. $1 trillion gone because of a 21-mile wide piece of ocean. March 27th, 2026. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, issues a formal announcement. The Strait of Hormuz is now closed to any vessel going to or from the ports of the US, Israel, and their allies. Not just restricted, not just monitored, closed. The IEA responds by taking an unprecedented step, releasing 400 million barrels from global strategic reserves onto the market. The largest emergency oil reserve release ever authorized in history. Oil prices dip briefly, then creep right back up. Saudi Arabia begins curtailing production, not by choice, but because its storage is filling up. With tankers unable to move oil out of the Gulf, crude has nowhere to go. Iraq does the same. Kuwait follows. You can't pump oil, you can't ship, so you stop pumping. Within weeks, the world is no longer just dealing with a shipping disruption. It's dealing with an actual production shutdown across the Persian Gulf. And just when diplomats thought they were close to a deal, marathon ceasefire extension talks collapse over the weekend. Trump announces the naval blockade. Iran calls it a violation.
So let's answer the only question that matters. Who wins? Who loses? Who wins? Russia. Energy revenues are surging as global buyers scramble for non-Middle Eastern oil. Moscow, isolated by Western sanctions after Ukraine, suddenly finds itself economically relevant again, selling oil to desperate buyers at premium prices. Who loses? Everyone else. Consumers, manufacturers, airlines, farmers, developing nations with no safety net. The irony is almost unbearable.
Now, before you sit back and think this is someone else's problem, let me tell you why you should be personally uncomfortable right now. This is the canary in the coal mine. The world has known for decades that the Strait of Hormuz was an existential vulnerability. Every major oil crisis in modern history, 1973, 1979, 1980, 1990, has involved this exact region. Every single time, the world patched up the damage and went right back to depending on the same choke point. Every time, experts warned the next crisis would be bigger. Every time, the warnings got ignored. Here's the pattern repeating today. 1. Critical infrastructure, single point of failure. Just like COVID exposed pharmaceutical supply chains, just like Taiwan exposed global chip dependencies, the world economy has never solved its addiction to narrow choke points. The Hormuz crisis is the same failure in a different place. 2. Countries weaponizing geography. Iran isn't just fighting a war, it's trying to institutionalize permanent leverage over a global artery. If it succeeds, even partially, it sets a precedent. What stops China from doing the same thing with Taiwan's semiconductor shipping lanes? What stops any country from weaponizing the infrastructure the entire world depends on? 3. The food price time bomb. The fertilizer disruption won't show up in your grocery bill today. It hits the next harvest cycle 6 to 18 months from now. The Food Policy Institute in London is already warning of long-term food price increases for corn, wheat, and rice globally. This is a slow-moving humanitarian crisis hiding behind the oil price headline. Which countries are most at risk next? Any large energy importer with limited fiscal room. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, nations across sub-Saharan Africa. These economies can't absorb a $40 per barrel oil spike. They spiral into debt crises, currency collapses, and political instability. Moody's supply chain lead Andre Quinn Barabano said it plainly. For many commodities transiting the strait, inventories typically cover only a few weeks, meaning shortages can emerge quickly if disruptions persist. We are weeks into a months-long crisis with no clear end in sight. The Strait of Hormuz has been a known single point of failure for 50 years. This crisis didn't happen because nobody saw it coming. It happened because the incentive to keep depending on cheap Gulf oil was always stronger than the incentive to build resilience. It's the same logic that gave us COVID supply chain disasters. We never learn until it costs us badly. Energy is geopolitics. This war isn't just about Iran's nuclear program. It's about who controls the world's energy future. China is partially shielded because it invested aggressively in renewables and EVs. Europe is exposed because it didn't diversify fast enough. The United States is feeling it at the pump despite being a major domestic producer. The countries that come out of this strongest will be the ones that use it as a forcing function to actually break their fossil fuel dependence. The ones who patch it up and go back to sleep, they'll face this again, probably worse. This affects you directly, even if it feels far away. Your gas, your groceries, your clothes, your electronics, your medication. The global supply chain runs on energy, and energy runs through Hormuz. When that pipe gets squeezed, you feel it. Maybe not all at once, but you will. The question is whether Washington is using this moment to build real energy resilience, or just waiting for the crisis to blow over.
Here's the question that no economist, no diplomat, no general can answer right now. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed through the summer? The IMF says global growth falls to 2%. The Dallas Fed says GDP losses compound every quarter. European airports are warning of summer flight cancellations. Fertilizer shortages start hitting crop yields by fall. And right in the middle of all this, two nuclear-capable powers, a U.S. naval blockade, and an Iranian regime with nothing left to lose are negotiating over a 21-mile strip of ocean. The world has never faced a crisis quite like this one, and the honest truth, nobody knows how it ends. What we do know is this: the energy world after this crisis will not look like the world before it. Countries will diversify, supply chains will be rebuilt, Choke points will be rerouted or bypassed. But that takes years, and right now we're living through the painful transition in real time. If this video helped you see the real story behind the headlines, hit like, share it with someone who's been wondering why everything costs more, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I want to know what you think. Is the world finally serious about ending its dependence on the Strait of Hormuz, or are we just going to patch this up and make the same mistake all over again? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one